challenging. And so I sort of feel like YA is in this space of evolution right now. We're not really sure what's going to happen next. But I also find that, a little thrilling because there's a lot more space to kind of carve out what you want to do and say and to connect with those readers who need to hear it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So trends, I don't know.
Yeah. Very good. I'm gonna slaughter your name, and I apologize for that.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah, I don't know. I'm thinking about trends, and do you know the thing? It depends a lot on how you talk about trends, on like whether you talk to teen readers or readers in general, or whether you're talking to aspiring authors or writers, or even just like all of us who have been published, but are still trying to figure out what publishing is doing at any given point in time. I think trends may exist more in the minds of writers and publishers than they necessarily do in the minds of readers. Readers are going to read what they like and what they're drawn to, and obviously there's this balance between what the market offers and what readers can find. But most readers are not suddenly going to read Merman because the market says that that's the trend. It's something that they find books that they like. It's something that appeals to them. And I don't think trends are necessarily all that important to most readers.
Mm-hmm.
I also have very conflicting feelings about the use of trends in general, because especially if you look at trend heavy years, that usually means non-marginalized versions of trends. And like people saying vampires are over is great when all we've ever seen are like white cishet vampires. Doesn't say anything about other people writing vampires. So honestly, I don't feel like trends are really that interesting unless it's very, very focused on trying to figure out what is going on. And I don't think that part is necessarily all that interesting either, because like Phoebe says, it's far more necessary for us and for publishing to figure out how we can get to a point where we tell the stories that matter and we lift up the voices that haven't been heard yet or have not been heard enough, and find ways to bring truth to readers. And if that's a trend, well, great, but yeah.
Right. You know what? I will say this. It makes me very counterculture, and I'm about to do something that is a career ender. New York Times bestseller list is not a trend.
No.
You know, we all know the way that works. If you know which bookstores report and you funnel your sales through those bookstores, you get on the New York Times list. There are certain books. I have a friend who writes The Dork Diaries, and it has legitimately sold 24 million copies. And I once went to a book signing where someone came up with my friend's book and said, "Would you sign this?" And I was like, "Well, no, but my book is right here," because it is it is truly a popular book. But you have other books that show up, and everybody says, "Oh, that must be the trend," and I'm going, I don't know a single teen reading that book, and I don't know. And I'm on a lot of panels. That people are reading that book. And so I reached out to a publicist just for grins. And I said, okay, what would it take? And I don't have a publicist. The publisher of Tribes is too small to have a publicist on staff. And the quote was $12,000 for 3 months of work. And that didn't cover all the books and all the postage. And I thought, well, wow. So if you were lucky enough to be in an environment where the publisher says, we're going to bet on that book, and they're shoving out a lot of copies, and you suddenly see 100 reviews on Amazon 2 days after the book came out, that's publicity. But what is a real trend? It's the ones where I'm gonna choke myself. But when Twilight came out, okay, here I am. Okay, when Twilight came out, I had two situations. I had a prolific reader in the house, And the librarian at the high school would say, hey, this just came in, and it would be a whisper, and would get her the book. And then when she's returning it, other teens are following her back to the library because they want to be the next to get the limited copies. And then my youngest kid, who was a reluctant reader, got into that. So, say what you might about that series. It got a lot of people reading. That's a trend. But I'm also noticing there's another trend that we don't talk about, which is one of the largest group of readers of YA literature is middle-aged women. And when they're recommending books to each other, that's a trend. But I don't think that always gets picked up. So, I have to agree with the previous comment. What's a trend? It's the books that resonate with a reader, and they are, and you're recommending it to a friend because something about that character's journey. It had nothing to do with being a vampire or a werewolf or a space starship captain. Something about that character's journey or that cast of characters' journey made you feel included and let you melt into that world for a while.
Mm-hmm. And I always find it fascinating. My daughter is only 6, so her media influences are a little different than the demographic we're talking about. But when you talk to real teenagers, I taught a Zoom class in about April through the local library, some young writers. They were adorable. And the things they're actually into, sometimes I feel like would shock both authors and publishing. Like, they wanted to talk about The Princess Bride, an entire class. Like, that's all they wanted to talk about. 2 of them had recently seen it. Or they were quoting Friends, things like that. And they're not the things you would expect. They're not necessarily sort of the moment, but they're things they've been exposed to in various ways. And the thing with Gen Z watching Friends and The Office, like, those are sort of these trends that go through local middle and high schools where they all, first they all watch Friends and talk about it, then they all watch The Office and talk about it. And I'm just fascinated by that kind of thing because that's not always something that's fully present in the conversations about what teens are looking at and thinking about, that sort of thing. I've been watching movies from my childhood with my daughter since quarantine, and it's funny how I didn't realize that most of those movies from the 80s and a lot from the 90s too are nostalgia pieces for baby boomers. And, Indiana Jones and Star Wars and all of these things have roots in what the creators loved as children. And if you find ways to bring that back in a way that feels really fresh, kids love it too. And I feel like that's sort of the key to figuring out what sort of books we should be writing. It's something you love that you make feel fresh, and that speaks to kids no matter what, no matter, what specific generation they're from.
I think to that point too, like you said, what we should be doing for teen readers is write books that they can be passionate about because they're books that we're passionate about, because the best thing you can offer someone is a great story. And it's not necessarily a great story written for them, but it's a great story. And one of the things that just the thing too, and Phoebe, you just said that, and that actually got me thinking. You said what they read and what they watch would shock most people. I think that's part of the problem in many ways, is that we have, often when we talk about trends and when we talk about the audience of books, we have this vague idea of what teens these days do and like and what they want. And so much of that is just our interpretation of nothing they've ever said, but just this vague idea we have of what teens are. And I think the best thing we can do is not try to write to that weird, like, nebulous idea of teen, but listen to what they're saying, find ways to not even like, by all means, let them have their own world and their own experiences, but just connect to the things that matter to them and connect to the discussions they're having, and find a way to just respect that. Because many times when we're talking about trends, or when we're talking about writing for teens in general, there's this idea of not taking teens seriously enough, I guess, is what I'm saying. And that's something I think does far more harm than anything we can do in terms of trying to figure out this publishing journey that we're all on.
Yeah, I think someone once told me, Linda Sue Park, who wrote Single Shard and several other books, and it was a Newbery, said, once you write your book and release it, it doesn't belong to us anymore. It belongs to the reader. And one of my greatest sources of feedback are librarians not telling me what they liked, but telling me what their readers liked. Because I mean, ultimately, we're not writing so that we can just have a book on the shelf. We're writing books so we can be read. And I know it was an uphill battle getting Tribes published. First, because multicultural and diversity was not a thing. And yet my children are growing up in an environment that is completely different than the environment that I grew up in. It's a lot less segregated. They have friends from all over the world now. They have traveled a lot. Their friends have passports. And those are the kids I'm writing about. But that's considered an oxymoron, for instance, because, Black kids don't travel, and, Black kids don't have passports. And, if you go by what publishers are still acquiring, Black kids still all live in a ghetto. They all go to public schools. They don't go to private schools. I grew up in the ghetto, but I went to a private school. So I got lucky because I found a publisher who, when she read the book, she had a kid, she was raising a kid, and he was frustrated with what he was reading, and she got all of the things other editors don't get. So she was looking for child reaction. And at one point she said her nephew came home and said, okay, where's the second book? And she says, what are you talking about? And he says, well, where's the second book? And she says, second book of what? And she said, the first one's not out yet. How do you even know? Well, she had gotten a box of ARCs, and when he was visiting, he borrowed without permission some of the ARCs, and that was the book that he gravitated to. And she said, well, we have to get the first book out before we do a second book. But I said, that's the best feedback. And then Highlights for Children said they knew which of their books were going to be most successful by which ones disappeared at night. When the ARCs came in, the cleaning crew came in, or there are people, which ones disappeared. And so, I say to publishers sometimes, get out of your head, get out of the conventions filled with adults, and get into schools and libraries where the people that we're theoretically writing for reside, and see what their reactions are. They don't care about the trends. They really care about, is something in this experience new and different and compelling, or is something in this character making me feel like I could be this person? So I'm predicting right now the new trend's going to be Mulan if they drop that price, because it's such a girl power story. I'm not going to pay $30 to watch it on Disney, but it's such a girl power story, and it's not told enough, that kind of story.
Yeah, it's usually a good idea to check with the librarians to find out what's really popular at the library. Again, with the caveat that trends, you can't write to a current trend because it's going to be passé by the time your book gets accepted by a publisher. But looking to see what is still popular, because I mean, the Goddess Girls is still a popular thing among the kids. Mythology of different cultures is coming out a lot more. You've got, you still have the Chosen One, but not the type of Chosen One you expect. It's still kind of being popular with the librarians, but with the librarians actually see what their readers are doing.
Mhm.
And I think, Christine, what you talk about with having an editor and a publisher that believes in you, even if it's a small publisher, is so important, because a lot of this, no matter how well you write to your heart and everything, it doesn't help if no one will publish it. And you have to find that one editor who really believes in what you're doing, and you have to find a publisher who will put a decent cover on it and get it in bookstores and libraries. I mean, those are access issues that need to be addressed. And I feel like I'm glad to be writing now when there's starting to be pushback against the idea that certain types of protagonists and certain types of stories can't sell unless they're super didactic, that kind of
Mhm.
thing. Not that there were always people writing marginalized populations, but I think there's starting to be sort of more space for those stories to have
Yeah.
great covers, and I find that really exciting too.
And it helps that there's small press out there that's willing to take a chance rather than the big titles. But again, with small press, you have to get the word out. So, I mean, it helps that there are like Facebook groups like We Need Diverse Books, A Mighty Girl, She Heroes, that will basically promote some of the smaller press books
Mhm.
and some of the ebooks.
Yeah.
Again,
You know
for-
what? I got lucky because the publisher that is doing Tribes, she was my editor at Scholastic, and she worked in the music business, and she worked for, I want to say McGraw-Hill before Scholastic. So she got me started writing nonfiction. So then, I remember getting a rejection from a big publisher that said, I don't think I'm smart enough to edit this book. And I just laughed and said, well, you only have to be as smart as a fifth grader, and, because I was writing in the Harry Potter space, which meant it would be accessible to teens and younger readers, but also written at a different level for adults. And so she got it. She wasn't intimidated by the science and the science fiction, and she understood the characters. But I think you make a really good point. It is very hard for smaller publishers to get seen in the landscape if we don't go out and identify those books and support them, because if they don't get that support, then all of a sudden you see Barnes and Noble and Amazon having to delist them. They have a harder time. She's distributed by IPG, Independent Publishing Group, which means that she's in Ingram's and Baker and Taylor. But I know a lot of other smaller publishers doing beautiful work that are still struggling for that kind of visibility. So I think it's the onus on us is to start those trends. Maybe that's the trend we start, is to say, where are the books we see resonating with teens and kids, and we boost their bandwidth so that it matches what the larger publishers are able to do with their budgets. And also those, I call them B-list authors in those large publishers, because they have already decided, hey, a Hunger Games is going to get all of the marketing budget, and everybody else at that publisher is kind of sink or swim. So I think social media can be the great equalizer, and we can, go on and say, hey, I just read this book, I think it's amazing.
I think to add to that too, like obviously, absolutely agree. We should promote those books. We should also, for as much as we can at the moment, promote indie bookstores that sell them, because aside from librarians who are absolutely awesome, and I basically grew up in my local library, I would say too that we live in a time, usually you find books to some extent by going to a bookstore and browsing. And we currently live in a time where that is impossible. And I'm very worried about many indie bookstores in Corona times in general, COVID times in general, but also with USPS discussions going on right now. We should find ways to make sure that those areas of access are able to survive the times that we're going through, because if those fall away, and if it's just up to especially places like Amazon, it's going to be so much harder for books to stand out and for readers to find books that aren't on the end caps, that aren't on the front pages.
Mhm.
So I think that that's an important discussion to have in the whole context of how do we make sure that those trends happen. It's
Mhm.
by supporting indie bookstores as much as libraries and all those various routes for readers to be able to access books.
Yeah. And I definitely feel like there's a component of this where we need to learn to self-advocate, which of course does not do everything. You could be an amazing self-advocate and not move very many copies. But I think there's something to be said for the way people who are assigned female at birth are raised about promoting themselves and talking about their own work with a certain sort of haze of embarrassment. You know, and I feel like that's been one of the things that I really learned through my debut experience is to not apologize, to, you know, ask for things that make me cringe inside a little bit because you feel like you might not deserve them. But if you can't ask for things and advocate for your work and really believe in your work, that's sort of step one in convincing other people that it's worthy, to be able to talk about your work in a way that makes it sound exciting and to be able to let that excitement that you have for your own work be infectious. And it's really, really hard because I'm still the person who goes into a bookstore shaking a little bit with my business card, but I'll still give them my business card and say, hey, I have a book coming out next year and this is my name and this is what the book's about and I'd love to do an event. And oh, it feels awful sometimes, but it's still really good to do. And if you could do that going into indie bookstores, and some of them are New York Times reporting, or, you know, and you can develop these mutually beneficial relationships where you support each other and it helps people read your books and you want your books to be read and you believe that they're important. So that's been something that's been important for me because if you can't talk about your work with enthusiasm and excitement, it's hard to get people to read it. So.
It's very counterintuitive because, you know, you're introverted while you're writing because you spend lots of time, you know, in front of a computer, in front of a blank white screen or page. And then you have to, you know, walk into a bookstore and be on, and it's counterintuitive. I had an intern for a while. I may have to get another one because it was helpful to have an extremely extroverted intern with no filters do the things that were harder for me to do. Yeah.
Sometimes I just pretend to be an extremely extroverted person. What would a person who's really good at selling their books act like? And I try to
What
act
would a
like
mediocre white man do?
I didn't want to say it, but you
I
know.
will.
They tend
The
to
White
ask for a
House.
lot more money than I do, I've learned. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's hard. You know, one trend I would like to see more of is um, books in which the female protagonist's journey is not reliant on a guy.
Mhm.
You know, you know, I raised two girls and they are strong girls. And when they started entering the romance phase, you know, and YA romance was big, I had to, you know, so they were trying to figure out why their relationships weren't matching the books. And I said, yeah, these are an editor's fantasies and these are some author's fantasy. This is not how the real world works. You know, there are no Edwards, you know, with unlimited wealth. But you know, we had good discussions, and then my husband was reading along with him. So watching the commentary, you know, like Harry Potter was called Hermione Granger and that other guy, because I started to figure out she kept giving him all the answers, you know. So she'd tell me the great wizard, but it was like, yeah, what is he really figuring out himself? And you know, they were very upfront. And I remembered one day there was a huge argument going on, and I came in, and I won't say the name of the author because I think everybody deserves their space, unless they're really famous, and then we can talk about them. And there was a scene in which, you know, are they going to get together or are they not going to get together? And this is his last opportunity because he won't be human, you know, after this night. and they decide, well, they're not. And then, so I'm listening to my husband and my girls go, no, that's not how it would really work. And it just kind of deflated the book for them, because they thought it was a safe answer, but it wasn't a real life answer. So that's one trend I'm looking for. And the other trend that we are really pushing, and this book it's not YA. Well, it's not quite YA. It's also not science fiction, but okay. So
that's great. That's a great
one. It's so good. It's so good.
It's my jam, and the reason why it's my jam is, one, he's middle class, and when they're talking about the issues that are related to him, being a Black kid, it's done with humor. It doesn't involve ghettos. All of the kids, regardless of their race, are experiencing all these microaggressions in school. And that's the trend that I want to see is those little known aspects of the rest of our lives that don't fit some safe trope stereotypes that the editors and publishers know, hey, we can go to. In Black life, it's there's not an intact family, in the YA, and there's a crime, or there's a ghetto, or now the trend is, ooh, there's a police shooting. And I'm going, I don't want that. So right after George Floyd died, everybody was coming up with, where are the YAs and where are middle grades and where are the books about race? And I'm married to a guy that's a lot like Mr. Rogers. And so he's watching me pace, and he's like, don't do it. Don't respond on that tweet. And finally, I sit down and go, listen, I'm a former college interviewer, and I'm a mom, and I'm an author, and I am telling you, right now, we're all under stress, and kids out there want to see themselves in stories like other kids have gotten. They don't want to translate. And when you're under stress, you don't want more stress. So how about this? For every book on racism, could you do 20 books about characters whose journey has nothing to do with a race-based problem? And I think that opened up the floodgates, because I got 500,000 views in the first week on that tweet, and ended up in the New York Times and the CBS local affiliate in Boston, because everyone was resonating with, sometimes you want a book to escape, sometimes you want to be able to see people doing other things. So we need people who are non-binary, and we need people who are of different ethnic backgrounds. Just being a witch it doesn't have anything to do with being a Black witch, or so I'm starting to see some openings where I'm seeing some publishers being more receptive to that, because frankly, we're all full up on the old tropes where it's, hi, I'm a YA was heavily centered around girls. Hi, I'm a helpless girl and I need a guy to save me. Or I need to pretend like I'm saving everybody, but I still need a PETA and a Gale and no, not my household. Nope.
I think for me, something that's been useful to remind myself is that most editors demographically come from higher income backgrounds, are white, are cis, and that's okay. But it does color the way those interactions can go about the things you can write, and sometimes they just need to be made aware of these biases they have, that they're not, and these stereotypes they're operating from. In my 2021 book, in the last part of the novel, the character goes on to college, and it's kind of a question as to whether she'll go on to college or not. And he said, do kids really struggle with whether they'll go away to college? That's just what they do. Maybe we'll make her go to boarding school. And I mean, he meant this in a, very genuine, helpful way, that he thought that this would be unrealistic to a lot of readers. And I said, oh no, that is still a question for a lot of kids, whether they'll have the money and the means and the ability, whether their family will be supportive of them moving away. Clearly, I need to speak to that more strongly in this, which I did, and he was supportive of that. But to have the wherewithal to kind of stand up and say, like, no, this is actually my experience, and it needs to be reflected in this book, and it will speak to other readers, and this is the experience of lots of kids out there. but it takes strength to kind of stand up to that, especially when someone is, very helpfully saying like, oh, that's not something people struggle with, or that's not something people want, So.
Mhm.
And
And it's not always race specific, because I
Mhm.
will tell you, I've had two odd experiences with two Black editors, and that's hard to say because there's not that many. Um, one didn't get it, and the other one, I wrote a boarding school story, and or actually a private school story, very similar to what Jerry Craft has achieved. And the editor says, you need to understand more about how private schools work, and I would like to recommend this other author who wrote this story about a kid going to boarding school. So I went to the bookstore and got it, and I was reading it, and I was like, this author's never been to boarding school, never ever been to board. I can tell reading this book, this author has not been to a boarding school. And when I looked at the acknowledgement, she is thanking all the people for the research. Um, that but I went to a boarding school, and my daughter went to a boarding school, and so it really comes down to, Jane Yolen, it surprises me when she gets rejections, and she will post on social media, she got rejections. And she says, the rejection means not that editor. It's not an indictment on your work. It's not that editor. Um, so I tell people, if you've got a story to tell, it's your story. Hopefully it's your story and your character's story, and you've come to some kind of agreement. Find that editor that gets it, because there is some reader out there that needs that story more than they need what a publisher has decided is going to be a commercial success. You know, that's my big issue. Is I got lucky, and I remember talking to Nettie Okorafor when she was a guest here in Kansas City, and I'm telling this story about my trajectory, and she said, "Wait, stop." And I said, "What?" And she says, "You have a Black editor?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, but I've worked with her." She says, "No, stop." And it became a conversation about, exactly what we're talking about is we have all of these different experiences. That's why there's so many books on a shelf. It's why so many different YAs is every reader is a lock, not every book is the right key. And you've got to find that editor that is willing to respect, help you make your writing better, but willing to respect that you're trying to unlock a specific door that maybe someone else has not unlocked. And so I got lucky. So I think we need more diversity in editing.
Mhm.
And I think you're right. Editing pays so poorly. You have all these people with second jobs, or they've got assets in the back. But we also need, and I'm just going to put it out there, we need more diverse editors who have the courage to fight for something that might not be popular. And for a very long time in publishing, we had editors of color who did not want to be identified as editors of color, which is why you saw so many people of color getting rejected even by those editors. It's because they were quietly saying, these books, are not going to get the support. So they were out acquiring white authors. And, let's be blunt, those books didn't do that well either. So, like I said, I'm older and have more insurance. And if my career dies today, so be it. But I've been doing this for 20 years, and I see a disconnect between editors and publishers chasing trends, which by the time the book is published is going to have gone away, and not spending enough time in the social circles of the people they claim to be acquiring books for. I think it would be an eye opener for them.
And we're getting close to the end of our time.
I just
we
add
didn't get
one thing to that quickly.
Sure.
Because Christina, I love your description right now. Like every book is a lock, and every book is a key, and every reader is a lock. And I think that really speaks to both discussions about trends, but also discussions about diversity, in the sense that we have this understanding that once you found one way to unlock a lock, that is the single way to do so. And that is why we rehash certain books to try to chase that same trend. But it's also why we struggle to have discussions about representations beyond this monolithic interpretation of this is what it means to be non-binary, this is what it means to be disabled, this is what it means to be Black. Because we have this idea of this is the right key. And once we found it, we're just going to go all in on that one. When ideally, in this particular, using this particular symbolism, every single lock has multiple keys, and we should figure out ways to broaden what we offer, as opposed to trying to chase the same book and the same key over and over again.
And that's a great note to end on, because we've got our 5-minute warning. So if panelists, could you say where people can find you? And wish we could have gotten some questions from the audience, but go ahead.
Who wants to go first? Should I go? I'll go first. You can find me at phoebenorth.com. I am also on Twitter /PhoebeNorth, on Instagram /PhoebeNorthAuthor, and Facebook /PhoebeNorthYA. None of those match. If you find me on one of them, you'll find links to the others.
You can find me on Instagram with my whole name, Christine Taylor Butler. Don't use the hyphen. I'm on Facebook. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, and there I'm just Christine, capital T, capital B as in, for Taylor Butler, no hyphen. But I'm around. As you can tell, I'm opinionated, but I'm around. Come play with us.
Opinionated is a good thing, right? Most of the time online. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, probably more than I should. So find me there. I'm at Mariekeyn. It's MARIEKEYN. And I have a book coming out in 3.5 weeks. Help. It's this one. It's called Even If We Break. It's an RPG thriller meets many queer and trans characters and disabled characters. So pre-order it, because pre-orders are great.
And I'm Catherine Sullivan. I'm at catherinesullivan.com. My publisher is In the Dealer's Room, Zumaya Press, one of my publishers. And at this point, we're going to end the panel. Thanks everybody who was listening to us. Thank you, panelists, for a great discussion. And
Awesome.